Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nurse your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today we're taking a deep dive into The Vineyard of Liberty. It's a fascinating look at early American history, and we're going to be looking at it through the lens of presidential leadership. We're not just talking dates and battles here, but we're going to uncover the human stories, the struggles, the personalities that shaped the nation. You might think you know the Founding Fathers, but trust me, there's always more to discover.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This isn't just another dry history lesson. What the Vineyard of Liberty really captures is that spirit of the time, that fervor surrounding the revolution. This ideal of liberty was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of society.
It really makes you realize that for the colonists, liberty wasn't just an abstract concept. It was a powerful driving force. The book talks about the Sons of Liberty. And they weren't just talking about revolution. They were organizing, protesting, making sure their voices were heard.
Right. And those liberty poles and trees they erected, they weren't just random symbols. They were gathering places, almost sacred spaces where people pledged their allegiance to the cause. It was a deeply personal commitment to this idea of liberty, even if it meant different things to different people.
So what did liberty actually mean to them? Was it just about freedom from British rule?
It was much more nuanced than that. For some, it was about religious freedom, the chance to worship without persecution. For others, it was about political representation, having a say in their own governance. And of course, there were those who saw it as an opportunity for economic advancement, a chance to break free from the constraints of the British mercantile system.
It's fascinating how such a simple word could hold so much meaning. But it wasn't a simple time, was it? The book mentions these clashes, even among the colonists themselves, over what liberty really meant.
Absolutely. The book really highlights this conflict between Baptists and Congregationalists in New England. It's a reminder that even within this shared pursuit of liberty, there were internal tensions, different interpretations of what it meant to be free. In this case, the Baptists, who saw themselves as the original settlers, they refused to pay taxes to support the established Congregationalist church. This power struggle really highlights the complexities of establishing true religious freedom in a new nation.
So we've got this fervent desire for liberty, this mix of ideals fueling the revolution, but also these internal conflicts bubbling beneath the surface. How did it all translate into the creation of a new nation? That's where James Madison enters the picture, right?
Madison is really the key figure here. He understood that turning those revolutionary ideals into a functioning government wouldn't be easy. He meticulously prepared for the Constitutional Convention, studying history, political theory, even coaching his fellow Virginians on how to navigate the personalities and interests of the other delegates.
It's like he was running a political campaign before the concept of campaigning even existed. The book highlights one specific tactic of his: ensuring George Washington's attendance. He knew Washington's presence would lend legitimacy and sway to the entire proceedings. And then there's the story about him practically force-feeding constitutional knowledge, force-feeding it to Edmund Randolph, who was too busy being governor of Virginia, to prepare adequately.
Madison was brilliant. He understood that building a nation wasn't just about abstract principles. It was about people, personalities, egos. He knew how to play the game, how to maneuver and compromise to achieve his goals.
So what happened at the convention itself? What were some of the defining debates that shaped the government we have today?
Well, one that really stands out is the debate surrounding judicial power. James Wilson, a strong advocate for a powerful national government, pushed for a strong judiciary. But John Rutledge from South Carolina was wary. He feared that too much power in the hands of judges would lead to tyranny, mirroring the very monarchy they had just fought to overthrow.
That tension is so relevant, even today, right? It reminds me of our modern concept of judicial review, where the Supreme Court can strike down laws it deems unconstitutional. It's a concept we often take for granted. But it was a fiercely debated issue back then. It makes you realize the profound impact those early decisions still have on our lives today.
It's a great point. And speaking of seemingly antiquated ideas, another fascinating debate centered around the creation of the Electoral College. Today, it might seem like a relic of the past. But the book explains that it was intended as a safeguard against the passions of the people. They were worried that direct popular vote could lead to rash decisions based on emotion rather than reason.
It's interesting to think about the context, too. Everyone assumed Washington would be the first president, so they probably weren't overly concerned about potential abuses of power.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the Anti-Federalists, the group that opposed the Constitution. They weren't just a bunch of naysayers. They had genuine concerns about centralized power and the potential for it to infringe on individual liberty. One anti-federalist argued that you could find 20 assemblies just as capable and patriotic as the one in Philadelphia in any state, highlighting a skepticism of the demigods who drafted the Constitution.
It was a clear message. Don't assume you're the only ones who care about liberty. And the book also mentions Mercy Warren, a prominent anti-federalist writer, who criticized the Constitution for not emphasizing virtue enough. She believed the success of a republic hinged on the virtue of its citizens, not just on a system of checks and balances. This contrasts sharply with the Federalist view, which emphasized managing competing interests and ambitions.
It's important to remember that even within the anti-federalist camp, there were diverse viewpoints and concerns. But it all boils down to this fundamental question. How do you balance individual liberty with the need for order and stability in a government? It's a question that continues to resonate today.
So here we have this brand new nation, built on compromises, held together by fragile hope, and facing incredible challenges. What happens next? How do those early years unfold?
Well, it's a precarious time, full of internal unrest, external threats, and this constant pressure to prove that a republic could actually function. A lot was riding on the shoulders of the first president, George Washington.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about that weight of expectations on Washington's shoulders, this almost mythical figure tasked with leading this brand new nation.
The Vineyard of Liberty does a great job of contrasting that heroic image with the reality of his presidency. He wasn't some stoic statue. He was a human being wrestling with immense challenges and doubts.
The book describes his arrival in New York City for his inauguration. Parades, cheering crowds, this whole scene of national celebration. But privately, Washington confided in his diary that he was filled with this sense of foreboding, almost dread.
Yeah, he wrote that the celebrations were as painful as they were pleasing, because he was so acutely aware of the fragility of it all, that the experiment could still fail. The nation could still fall apart.
Talk about pressure. And on top of all that, he had to figure out what it even meant to be president. There was no blueprint, no guidebook. He was setting precedents with every decision he made.
And those decisions weren't always easy. The book talks about his Southern tour, where he traveled through these newly formed states. To get a sense of the nation he was leading, he observed the different approaches to education, contrasting the rigorous academic focus of Phillips Academy with the more practical, hands-on learning in places like Lexington.
It highlights that tension between these two visions of America, the refined intellectual elite versus the rugged, self-reliant frontiersman. It's a tension that's woven throughout our history, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And speaking of tensions, Washington also had to contend with internal unrest. The Whiskey Rebellion might seem like a minor historical footnote now, but it was a major test of his authority and the power of the federal government.
Kind of ironic, considering Washington was a whiskey distiller himself. But he understood that this wasn't just about a tax on whiskey. It was about challenging the legitimacy of the government he was trying to build.
Right. His decision to personally lead troops to quell the rebellion sent a clear message. The federal government had teeth, and it wasn't afraid to use them. It set a precedent for how future presidents would deal with challenges to federal authority.
So we've got Washington establishing the presidency, navigating these complex issues, trying to hold the nation together. What about his successor, John Adams? How did his leadership style differ?
Adams is a fascinating figure, often portrayed as this rigid and conservative leader. But the Vineyard of Liberty offers a more nuanced view. It highlights his deep distrust of human nature, his belief that people were inherently prone to selfishness and ambition.
Which is interesting, considering he helped create a government based on the idea of popular sovereignty.
Exactly. It speaks to the complexities of his thinking. He believed in democracy, but he also recognized its potential pitfalls. He saw the need for strong leadership, for checks and balances to keep those baser human instincts in check.
So how did this view of human nature shape his approach to governing?
Well, he championed a strong central government, the rule of law, and a system of checks and balances to prevent any one person or faction from gaining too much power. He also saw education as vital to cultivating a virtuous citizenry, capable of self-government.
But he wasn't just an ideologue, he was also a pragmatist. The book discusses how he navigated the quasi-war with France, this undeclared naval conflict. He managed to avoid a full-blown war, which was probably the wisest course of action, but it cost him politically.
It's a great example of how leadership often requires making tough choices, unpopular choices, for the greater good. Adams put the nation's interests ahead of his own political ambitions, which ultimately helped preserve the young republic.
So far, we've seen Washington and Adams, each in their own way grappling with the challenges of leadership in those early years. They established the foundations of a nation and faced down internal and external threats. But as the Vineyard of Liberty shows us, the story of American leadership is far from over.
The nation's on the cusp of rapid expansion and change, with westward expansion new political factions, and the looming shadow of slavery, all set to define the next chapter of American history.
Sounds like we're about to enter some pretty turbulent waters. And on that note, let's continue our deep dive into the Vineyard of Liberty as we explore the challenges and triumphs of American leadership in the 19th century. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Vineyard of Liberty. We've journeyed through revolution, the birth of a nation, those first shaky steps of the American experiment, and now we're stepping into the 19th century, an era of unprecedented growth and expansion, but also, as we're about to discover, one of mounting tension and division.
Yeah, this period is fascinating because westward expansion really tests the limits of this young republic. It wasn't just about conquering new territories. It was about grappling with those competing visions for the nation's future.
The book paints such a vivid picture of Philadelphia at this time, this bustling hub of commerce and culture, attracting people from all corners of the country. You can almost imagine how those coming from smaller rural communities must felt, drawn to the excitement and opportunity of this growing city.
Right, it truly showcases America as this melting pot of cultures and aspirations, but this dynamic also brought friction. The book uses the Pennsylvania legislature as a prime example. It was dominated by these radical thinkers who fervently believed in direct representation, this idea that elected officials should perfectly mirror the will of the people.
Well, that sounds like a pretty solid democratic principle. What's the issue there?
Well, the principle is sound, but in practice it led to a great deal of instability and infighting. Everyone had a voice, but no one could agree on a unified direction. It was chaos.
Enter Thomas Jefferson stage left. He really emerges as this master strategist, someone who could harness those competing interests and forge a lasting political coalition.
Exactly. Jefferson understood that delicate dance of politics. He was brilliant, but he was also a shrewd political operator. And the book draws this fascinating contrast between his public image as this champion of the common man and his private life, which was actually quite austere. He resided in a surprisingly modest president's house, a far cry from the grand estates of the Virginia aristocracy.
It's like he was consciously embodying this ideal of Republican simplicity, despite his privileged background. And then there's the Louisiana Purchase, this defining moment in his presidency. It was a massive land acquisition that literally doubled the size of the United States, a huge win for Jefferson, but also had some unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, the Louisiana Purchase is a classic example of how even the most celebrated triumphs can have unintended consequences. It opened up these incredible opportunities for expansion and development, but it also reignited that debate over slavery and its expansion westward.
And the book dives into the Lewis and Clark expedition, which Jefferson commissioned to explore this newly acquired territory. It's a gripping tale of adventure and discovery, but it also highlights the sheer magnitude of the challenge facing the nation. Imagine traversing thousands of miles through uncharted wilderness, encountering new cultures and dangers at every turn.
It was an incredible feat of courage and determination. And let's not forget the pivotal role of Sacagawea, the Native American woman who served as their guide and interpreter. Her contributions were indispensable to the expedition's success.
Absolutely. And the Vineyard of Liberty doesn't shy away from the darker side of westward expansion either. It recounts the Aaron Burr conspiracy, this audacious plot to carve out an independent empire in the West. It's a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition and the fragility of a young republic.
It also underscores those persistent tensions, simmering between different regions and their competing interests. The West was seen as this land of boundless opportunity, but it also became a battleground for political power and influence.
And then, of course, there's the War of 1812, this war that almost no one wanted, but would ultimately shape the destiny of the nation.
It's remarkable how ill-prepared the United States was for that conflict. They were facing the mightiest military force in the world, and yet they managed to achieve some stunning victories.
The book tells the story of the Battle of New Orleans, this pivotal battle. That took place after the war had officially ended. Andrew Jackson, a future president, rallied this ragtag group of soldiers and volunteers to victory against a much larger British force. It's a testament to American resilience and determination, and it was a story that helped solidify a sense of national identity.
But beneath the surface of that victory, deep divisions were festering. The Vineyard of Liberty delves into the rise of sectionalism, that growing chasm between North and South, fueled primarily by the issue of slavery.
And this is where we see the emergence of new political factions, right? The book talks about the Waterside Yankees, this elite group of New England Federalists, who felt increasingly alienated from the national political scene.
They saw the westward expansion of slavery as a direct threat to their way of life and their vision for the future of the nation. Some even entertained that radical notion of secession, an idea that would resurface with a vengeance a few decades later.
It's important to remember it wasn't just about slavery. There were these profound economic and cultural disparities as well. The South was predominantly agrarian, reliant on slave labor. While the North was rapidly industrializing, these fundamental differences would only widen in the lead-up to the Civil War.
And the issue of slavery was so intricately intertwined with political power. Southern leaders viewed the expansion of slavery as essential to preserving their influence in the national government.
So we've seen how the nation expanded, evolved, and ultimately fractured in the years leading up to the Civil War. We've seen presidents, politicians, and ordinary citizens grappling with the complexities of leadership. In a world undergoing rapid transformation, it's a story of ambition, idealism, compromise, and ultimately tragedy.
And it leaves us with this final thought-provoking question. How do the lessons of early American leadership resonate in our own time? We face new challenges and divisions that test the very fabric of our democracy. What can we learn from those who came before us, from their successes and their failures?
It's a question worth pondering. And if you're interested in exploring these themes further, I highly recommend checking out The Vineyard of Liberty. It offers such a rich and insightful perspective on the enduring power of leadership and the complexities of the American experiment. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and purchase the book via the link provided. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into The Vineyard of Liberty.